This week we'll be talking through a couple of the changes that I've made to the interior with regards to the MX5 MGB engine conversion. I'll show you how I did my DIY wrinkle finish dashboard, as well as modifying the MGB gauges to accept the MX5 gauges. I'll be making a custom bonnet pop without a cable, which will help keep the engine bay clean. The heater box undergoes a refurb and some weight saving. And I managed to shed an easy 1.6 kilo from every single vehicle I own. In the last video I finished off by fitting the early chrome bumper radiator. The next logical job was to move on to the fan. I took some 4mm aluminium strip that was 30mm wide and made a couple of brackets that bolted onto the original radiator mounting system. That gave me something to mount the 10-inch fan to. Of course, whilst the fan was off, that underwent a slight diet. This is actually a used fan from a previous project, so it's surprising it's not already been hacked up. One thing I will say about these universal fans is the little brackets on the back. The plastic tab that pokes out from the bottom is slightly too long and it leaves like a little gap there. So what I tend to do is just shave those down with a knife and then reinstall them, and it just gives a slightly better fit. You can see here I just used a tap to just cut away some of the plastic so that the mounting bracket mounted even more flush. Next up, I drilled a couple of holes just to add some lightness, and then I stamped into the brackets top and bottom so that there was no confusion during future assembly, disassembly, which way around these would go. I painted those up with a couple of coats of clear coat, and whilst that was setting, I jumped onto the radiator hoses. When you're about to cut silicone hoses, just make sure you've got a fresh knife blade. I was using an old blade here, it was just what I had, and it just makes the job so much harder and less neat. That all bolted up quite nicely. I'm very happy with how that turned out. The top, however, I struggled to find a simple solution to get this to work neatly. I had a 90-degree 28mm hose kicking about, so I tried that on but wasn't happy with how it fit. I ordered one of these flexible 28mm hoses and I wasn't happy with how that looked either, so I ended up making a joining piece between two 90-degree bends. This does add a touch of weight with two more clamps and then the aluminium joining piece, but I do feel it was the neatest solution. Here's an overview of the radiator fan install as well as the coolant pipes. One of the next jobs I wanted to attack then was the bonnet pop. I didn't want to run the original steel cable that went through the engine bay, one from a weight saving perspective, but also from decluttering the engine bay. So this is quite hard to explain, but you can see how that the pin section at the top of the bonnet pop is quite small. That meant that when I welded this piece onto the bottom, it kind of put a sideways motion and it locked up the pin. It's quite hard to show, but if you can see as I push down on the top here, the mechanism doesn't want to operate. But if I just have one finger just held up where I would weld some sort of stud or metal support, which would effectively increase the length of the hinge, that the lever actually operates the pop. So what I'm going to do is take this small length of push rod that I've cut up and bend into shape. I'm going to weld that on there, give everything a little bit of a tidy up, and then just see how well that works. Now everything's welded up, it's a little bit easier to see sort of how the hinge section has increased in length, but also how the lever operates cleanly. I'm going to go ahead and install that and just check everything works as it should with the spring attached. And you can see now that the operation of the bonnet pop is super easy with one finger, which I can just slip my fingers between the grille, and also from the outside you wouldn't even know this was there. So you remember last time we made this new crossmember for the gearbox out of a piece of 90-degree section welded into the original crossmember. I've been struggling sleeping at night just with the weight of this thing and the fact that I was going to get round to Swiss cheesing it and taking some weight out, but the more I've thought about it, the more that I just want to remake this from a piece of bar I'm going to cut off the original end pieces, which I could remake these out of a piece of angle section which sort of hung down from the chassis or went up into the chassis, but I quite like these recessed areas around where the bolts go, and I do feel like I could reuse what is effectively a scrap subframe. So I'm going to cut out what I can to allow me to weld in this piece of bar, and then from that point I'm going to weld in the gearbox mount, leaving myself a little bit of room to shim the mount up and down, which I didn't do last time. Here you can see what the finished article has turned out like. I started assembling this onto the car, and you can see at this point where I put the little shim in just to lift the gearbox up. It gives me some adjustment down the line should I need it for clearance for anything. Whilst I was underneath the car, there was two other things that I wanted to do. First up was fit a new anti-roll bar, but also fit the prop shaft which I'd had made. Whilst everything's in bits, I've taken the opportunity to upgrade the original 5/8 to a 3/4 anti-roll bar. I'll be remaking some drop spindles because the bushes on these are absolutely shot. I got this kit from David Manner's group. It turns up, everything's bagged, it turns up with all the correct hardware to install it, which really bugs me when people send you things and they don't have all the things included, but they're even down to the brackets down for the new poly bushes as well. I can't recommend that kit enough. The anti-roll bar bushes, when they're on the car, they're in this orientation. To get the bar through, you need to put a slit in these, and it does make sense to put the slit in the factory position so that any forces going up aren't there to separate the bushes. The next job, I'm going to repair these drop links. Some of them have got a little bit of damage in the top, so when I shot blast them, I'm just going to run a bead of weld around there just to strengthen things up a little bit. I know that the new rod ends that I've got are 50mm from the eye to the top, so with the car being quite low, what I'm going to do is mark up at 70mm, and that's where the thread wants to stop. So probably going to want 25mm of thread engagement, so they're going to be wanting to get cut around this mark here. So the main reason for doing this is these are quite expensive, these whole links when you need to replace them, and the bushes really don't last very long inside. So if I'm going to be using this car daily, I've actually gone through a set of these drop links in the last year or so. The ones that were on the other anti-roll bar, you can see they were quite heavily worn. Whereas the rose joints I can just screw out, screw a new one in. I'm just going to run an M12 die nut down the shaft. Unfortunately I was a little bit rough with the die nut holder. I guess you could say that is dyed. Whilst the drop links were off the car, I screwed the rose joints down to check that they were both the same length. I used M12 half lock nuts here just to save a little bit of weight, and it just looks a little bit more refined than big standard chunky nuts. And then the last custom piece on this is a 15mm spacer with a 12mm through hole. It also acts as a slight dust guard. With it being a bigger diameter, it stops some of the dirt ingress into the rose joint. It just shows you the length of the prop shaft versus the MGB one. Comes at 75cm from the centre of the two yokes. And one thing to note is there's actually two different types of splines as far as I'm aware. See that there's a missing tooth there, and there's a missing tooth on this side. I believe the 5-speed and 6-speed ones are different. I believe. Double check yourself. Go ahead and install that then. My accuracy with the prop shaft is obviously questionable. Just showing that the 4 bolts on the back went up okay, no problem. The front yoke is a little bit close to the gearbox, but that's because I haven't set the axle centerline correct yet. So the axle actually needs to move back around 20mm. I'm going to show you a couple of ideas that I've got for the heater box. For First of all, the air would usually come in from the top here. That's blanked off at the moment, so that recirculates the air and just helps keep it a little bit warmer when you're using these cars in winter. But the air would come through the back here, so that would go into this hole here, and then the blower pushes the air down through the heater matrix, which goes horizontal across here, and then that comes out the bottom here, and there's a little lever there at the bottom which basically rocks forward and backwards, and that chooses whether the air comes out of the holes at the bottom, which are those two holes, or you can choose to put the air to the footwell. Try and get a bit of weight out of this, but also just make it a little bit more simple. So I've never once used the heaters on the low setting for one of these cars. It's always just on full bore. So to me it just seems stupid having all of these different speed settings for the motor. You've got two wires going into the motor there. Those are the two that you need. The other ones that go to the inside, they go to this like resistor of some description. That can come out, save some weight. There you go, easy few grams. And now it's just a 2-wire switch that you need instead of. So the heater matrix itself, that's a copper brass version. It's 1 kilo, so it's not horrific in fairness. This is quite heavy for what it is. It's just a piece of tinware, and if you look, this piece that does the demist to the feet vent, that's the majority of the weight, and that's 1.7 kilo. The problem with deleting this deflector plate then is that the air is going to go up to the demister as well as coming down into the footwell at all times. So to combat that, I'm going to make some sort of restrictor plate which will screw into the footwell vents to restrict the airflow to the footwell. I tend to drive around with the heaters on the demist setting anyway, so I don't think this is going to affect me. If it does, I'll come up with a simple air metering device. This piece here is coming in at 1.5 kilo roughly, so a lighter motor there might make a difference as well. I'll probably try and just drill a couple of holes in here and shave the corners, that sort of thing, just trying to get the weight out where we can. One thing to note as well is I'm probably going to be able to cut across all the way to the bottom of here, because all that was doing before was housing that control system. That can all just get chopped off now as well to get some more weight out. And then this piece is probably, yeah, that can go on a diet as well. I don't know whether to try and remake some of this out of aluminium, but I might just be for the sake of it. Once you really don't want the vibrations of the heater motor sending anything coming loose. So it probably wants to be quite strong, plus I like the Smiths stamped radiator, so I'll probably just blast that up and repaint it. I repaired a couple of holes that were on the casing of the front plates there, and then I shot blasted all the heater components, put those into paint. Whilst I was waiting, I moved on to the bonnet hinges. It seemed a good idea to refurb them and paint them. I drilled a lot of holes, which only resulted in a 36 gram weight saving, but it does all add up. Back onto the heater assembly then, the matrix goes into the body, and I used a little bit of spare foam from the MG midget seats just to pack out where the matrix goes, stop any rattling. There's slightly more room for movement in there now due to me cutting the bottom of the box off. The motor went back in, and then the clips onto the housing to secure it. The final weight comes back at 3.64 kilos. From the heater knob and control system, as well as the other bits that I've cut off, there's nearly a full kilo in weight saved from this. With the lower part of the heater box removed, the install is now super easy. It's usually quite a tricky job on these cars. The last thing to do was button up the bonnet hinges. So inside the cab, there's these vents. That's the sort of noise they make when you try open and close them. Absolutely awful things. They weigh loads, they stick down, they look numb. And most of the time when you do want them completely sealed off, the seal around the outside is shot, so it actually just leaks air out onto your legs anyway. So middle of winter, I hate these things. It's a convertible anyway, so I don't really want airflow onto my legs. I just have the window down if I want airflow, or the roof off. So I'm going to remake this out of aluminium, try and save some weight whilst I'm at it. Whilst the steel fresh air duct only came back at 365 grams, the new one that I created from this fiberglass sheet only weighed 54 grams. With the fresh air vent gone, there's a small limiting device that's left inside the cavity. The only tool that I could get access to remove this was a pair of pliers, so I eventually bent that out of the way. I cleaned up what I could and painted inside to try and prevent any further corrosion. I installed the fiberglass plate with some seam sealer and the original 2 mounting screws from the fresh air duct. The top right screw also secures the voltage gauge stabiliser for the fuel and coolant gauges. I've deleted the plastic vents which usually go onto the dashboard. After taking into account the blanking grommets but also the steel that I put back into the dashboard, the net weight saving here is only 220 grams. I bought a set of cheap MX5 Mark I gauges which have the correct cable drive for the speedometer, which I plan to use with the gearbox that I have. The gauges proved quite difficult to get into. I'm used to French and old British cars where things tend to just fall apart, whereas these took quite a little bit of persuasion. I inserted a couple of knife blades in the plastic clips around the housing and everything came apart easy enough after that. Just a quick look at an 80mm gauge pod against this MX5 gauge then. So there's absolutely no chance that you'll get one of these to fit into the 80mm gauge pods. Luckily enough, I've had a few different MGs over the years and I had a couple of these 100mm gauge pods kicking about. To take the Smiths gauge apart, I just pry all of these little locking tabs on the outside and then you just rotate the outer bezel and then eventually that'll just pop off. Carefully remove the seal and then the inner bezel. To take out the speedometer unit, you need to remove the 2 screws on the back as well as the faceplate, and then don't forget to take off the odometer wind back as well. Just offering up the Smiths gauge to the MX5 clocks and everything looks like it should fit. The back of the Smiths gauge I had to open up to allow the MX5 innards to pass through. I'm just going to re-drill the face of the Smiths dials as I'd like to maintain the Smiths dials if possible here. And then this plastic piece here which stops the odometer numbers locking up against the faceplate, I've just cut down to make into a spacer. I did manage to get everything to screw back up, but unfortunately the trip counter I wasn't able to maintain. It's not really such a problem for me, I'll make up some sort of blank, probably just using insulation tape or similar. I did have a brief look at trying to get the MX5 tachometer to fit into the Smiths gauge, but it didn't look to me like there was an easy way to do this. Emerald ECUs actually sell a tacho driver to allow you to use the old Smiths gauges. For the sake of £36, it just didn't make sense to start hacking this up. I ran the gauge pods through the shot blaster and painted everything up. Whilst that was drying, I moved on to the switch panel and the dashboard. I had some 60mm wide 3mm thick aluminium plate which I drew a line across the middle of and then drilled 7 holes for the switches to go into. I will actually only need 6 switches as far as I can think, but I do like to have a spare on there, whether it's for a map switch perhaps down the line. I have to cut away the lower part of the dashboard to allow clearance for the switches. The piece which I've cut away acts as a perfect template for the new blank which I'll be welding back in. Whilst the dashboard's out, I decided to drill a couple of holes underneath where the glove box mounts. I also drilled the holes for the fuel and coolant gauges, and then fit some riv nuts where the switch panel mount will go, but also a aluminium dash blank on the far right hand side. The last thing I wanted to do was paint the dashboard with a wrinkle finish paint. I've had mixed results from using wrinkle finish from a spray can in the past, so what I tend to do now is get some black metal paint, and then you want to get yourself an old as brush as possible, one that's preferably got messed up bristles that are all at different angles, and then what I do is sort of dab the paint on, and then after 20 minutes in front of the heater, once the paint's gone tacky, just go over the top and dab more paint on. Repeat this process maybe 4 to 5 passes with the paint, and it brings out a lovely consistent wrinkle finish. Whilst that was drying, I moved on to stamping the labels onto the switch panel. I drew a line at the bottom and then carefully lined up all of the letters. I find that you get a better, crisper result from the letters if you have a metal base plate underneath the piece that you're working on. A friend of mine, Ben, also suggested that if you get a block or a piece of wood or metal to clamp onto the top of the piece that you're working on, you can use that as a guide to go up to, which means that you only have to position the characters left and right. Unfortunately, I hadn't thought of that, but I'll remember it for next time. Of course, the last thing to do with the switch panel then is insert the switches. If you look on the bottom of these toggle switches, there's a small little groove which indicates which way up they need to go. I found the best tool to tighten these up is the same tool that you get with mountain bikes for tightening the rear sprockets. It's a 2mm thick multi-tool spanner that slots in the back there nicely. At this point I started working on the standalone ECU wiring loom. I haven't covered much of that in this video. The next video will likely cover the majority of that, but I couldn't put the dashboard back in until some of the loom sections from the engine were run. I'll also cover the car rewire during that video too, but for now I'll show you the 2 plates that I made, one to mount the relays onto in the passenger footwell, and then a fiberglass plate that I made to mount the fuse board onto in the driver's footwell. No reason for changing different materials, it was just what I had available. You could tuck these up underneath the dashboard or in the bonnet or boot if you weren't concerned about the weight of the wires. I quite like the look, but also the practicality of being able to see and access relays and fuse boxes easily. With regards to fuse box selection, this is the type that I like to use. There's one common input from your battery which powers the entire fuse box, and then you take off from each of the little screwed terminals. Circuits individually fused then, and then there's the little LED lights that you can see on the strip on the inside there, and if you have a fuse failure, it's easy to see which circuits are causing the problem or which fuse you need to replace. I'm going to flash back here to before the engine and gearbox were installed. I marked out and cut to weld into the tunnel the hydraulic handbrake mounting post. I wanted to run this vertical just to keep the inner cabin as free from brake lines and cables as possible. Once that was welded in, I cut an 80mm hole for the gear shifter, which will sit further back than the original MGB one did. On the side of the gear shifter chrome bezel, I'm going to have to put some sort of material in there which will clamp up against the carpet and just sort of finish everything off nicely. The last thing to do would be to just go around and deburr and make sure everything's nice and smooth. The hydraulic handbrake position was governed mainly by the gearbox location. I did know that I'd have to put a slight bend into the handle. I just mocked up to take a couple of measurements for that. Right, one thing that's very important if you are going to bend this is just make sure that you bend it the correct way, to be honest. Good as scrap that now. Use sausage. Perfect as well, otherwise. Nice job, Mike. Once I got over that debacle, I ended up actually making 2 different types of handles before ordering a third one, which I would measure and bend a little bit more carefully this time. You'll see the install of that shortly. So with everything that required cutting or welding figured out, I could put the carpet back in and start installing the fuse box and the relay boards for the final time. The dashboard then went in along with the glove box. I then made a gearbox cover plate from 1mm thick aluminium. The original versions are made from sheet steel and come back at 178 grams. This came back at 63 grams, which net another 100 plus grams saving. Once the mint condition floor mats were reinstalled, I could put the seats back in. Here you have an overview of how the interior is looking. You can see that the hydraulic handbrake is in the best position that it could be. It allows plenty of clearance to the indicator stalk. I'm really happy with how the dashboard wrinkle finish effect has turned out. Like I said, I've had some really inconsistent finishes from these in a rattle can over the years, so it's nice to get a finish that you can consistently get every time. I think most people would have gone for black dial surrounds, black steering wheel and trim pieces, but I quite like how the aluminium pops. The main weight savings this week came from the crossmember and the heater boxes, which were both nearly a kilo. Unfortunately, the hydraulic handbrake added nearly a kilo as well. The total weight saving this week still comes in at a cock air over 2 kilo. I've set myself an aim for 2025 to lose at least 50 kilos from the body shell of this car, just with creative weight saving. If that's something that interests you, I'll be posting a weekly update where I can on Instagram, but I'll also cover these gains during these videos, at least until the engine swap's done. Thank you for watching, and tune in next time for more specifics around the MX5 engine swap. I do really appreciate everybody that does subscribe and comment on the channel. It lets me know to keep these sort of videos coming. So if it's something that you did enjoy, please click that button. Thanks again for watching.